Me?
Yeah, I think you should.
All right. Well, welcome to the 2 month review where we take big books, read them over a long period of time. Some might say approximately 2 months, and then we discuss them and pick them apart. Sometimes we fall behind on our reading if you're like me, but we always land the plane. And we are here for the final episode of the Tunnel episode. Season, Tunnel by William Gass. And we are here. I am Kaija Straumanis, editorial director at Coffee House Press, and I am joined this week, as almost always, by Brian Wood, author of Joytime Killbox. Hello, Brian. How are you?
Hello, Kaya. Great. Great to be here. Glad we're getting done with this book. I'm ready to put it down.
My wrists are aching. And also by Chad W. Post, publisher of Open Letter Books. How are you, Chad?
I'm okay. Classes started this week.
That is a loaded statement. And the cherry on top for our final episode of the Tunnel season. Back again for a third time, Ted Morrissey, author of many things. And
I actually I like your bio that comes up at the top of your website. Novelist, poet, scholar, educator, and theorist.
All right.
yes. And also, I believe with the capital T, great mind behind the tunnel at 25 blog, which I was just reading this morning. Ted, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. I would have worn red if I'd known that metaphor of being the cherry on top was coming. I would have played along with that. Yeah, I
I
think
mean,
before,
I think you're the pudding in the middle, or maybe I'm the
it's
pudding in the middle of the cake.
well,
it's better to be the cherry on top or the pudding in the middle than the fart at the end of the book.
true. Absolutely true. Yeah. Yeah, before you came on, Kai, I think I was encouraged to mention that I too have a podcast, a lesson before writing, and we post monthly, although we have some bonus episodes every now and then. But our shtick is kind of the opposite of what you guys do. Instead of taking a really big book and spending a long time on it, we're I co-host with Grant Tracy and Brady Harrison, and and we have basically 45 or 50 minutes of just sort of writerly chit chat just about our tagline is writers, editors, publishers, and teachers talking about writing, editing, publishing, and teaching. So we just kind of kick around stuff either we're working on or stuff that's come up in class since we're all three teachers or whatever. And in the last 30 minutes or so, we talk about a featured short story, which is from a very recently published literary journal. And so we talk for about 30 minutes about, the story, some of the craft techniques that author is using, and just kind of play off of that. Very informal, but usually around about 80 minutes or so. And like I said, once a month is our shtick. We've been doing it now for like 3.5 years. So
Excellent. Well, we will make sure Chad puts that in the show notes. Just before we get into the tunnel part, do you guys do the same literary journal every time as the source, or do you bounce around with those as well?
yeah, we bounce around. I get a lot of literary journals, and so I just kind of pick a story that I obviously read kind of through them, and pick one that I think will be interesting to talk about, or that I think the author needs some chops or whatever. And so yeah, there's no real formula to it, but I get a lot of journals. We've done it Monday. We recorded an episode and did a story out of Volume Zero, which is
Oh
actually the
yeah.
second time we've done a Volume Zero story, and they're out of New York, and I just love that journal. It is so hip, and it's way too hip, for me. I probably, if they knew I was one of their subscribers, they probably would cancel my subscription. Brings down their rep. But anyway, yeah, we'll do Mississippi Review, Michigan Quarterly Review, all kinds of things. I like to do international journals. We've done a couple stories out of Sand, which is out of Berlin,
Mm,
Germany.
Yeah.
So anyway, we try to mix it up.
Incidentally, Sand was, I believe, Chad, correct me if I'm wrong, started by a translator who translates some books for Open Letter, among other, B. Crook, or was one of the
Oh,
founding editors, at
I
least,
think it
back
was one of the
when,
founding editors. I think there was
yeah.
I associate with another German translator whose name I'm
Mm.
blanking out on. But yeah, I think you're right.
But there's a nice connection. That's really
Here's your
cool.
favorite. The cat is interrupting already. He is not gonna let this go.
Once upon a time, there used to be a 2 month review bingo, and I think pet or child interference was always on the card.
Yep. Yep. That
Yeah.
was fun.
Awesome. Well, I don't know that I can steer the ship the entire time, but I do think I want to open with a couple things. First of all, I did finish the reading for for today, so I'm going to clap for myself. And of this section of the reading, there are two lines or sort of two statements that I think I want to sort of present to the three of you, and we can sort of kind of like choose your own adventure and choose a direction because I think both these lines or half lines encompass a lot of what's going on. So the first one is the idea of the closing of the family fist was the first one.
Okay.
And the second one, that's kind of at the top of the section. And the second one is if we had a dog, it could be blamed.
I think that's what I think that's the role of Sean McDermott for the Bills.
Yes.
Sure.
He's the dog that could be blamed.
So
Well,
those are my two recommendations for directions.
your first one, that metaphor, maybe is an opening for me to say that when I listened to my little rundown of Gass's career, I realized I probably left out a fairly important detail. And so, if you don't mind, I'll add to that a bit. I mentioned he was his PhDs in philosophy, but if you read his dissertation, which I have, he wrote on the metaphor. His dissertation is like this huge, a deconstruction and analysis of how metaphors work. If you would have shown me that the dissertation without his name and without me having any context, I just kind of read a few pages, I'd probably say, wait, this is probably a dissertation like, I don't know, linguistics or philology or maybe Rhet theory, because he kind of gets into then how to have different, like John Donne, et cetera, Milton, how do they use metaphor in a rhetorical sense and whatever. And so I think that obviously makes way more sense when we look at his interest in language and so forth. And and it seems kind of weird, but then that got me thinking that when I was an undergrad about a million years ago, one of the required courses was in logic, and it was always held in like these 400 student auditoriums. And luckily, my roommates were all a year older than me, so they could always tell me what courses to take and what not to take. And they said, "Okay, you got to take this class, but it's taught by both the philosophy department and the math department. Make sure you take a section by the philosophy department." So that was like, it was all about syllogisms and the logic of language and all that kind of thing. Versus, I suppose, in math they got into algebra and stuff. I don't know what they did, but I think Gass was kind of in that track of philosophy mainly, how language impacts our thinking and vice versa and so on. And I think we can see that again represented with just his love of metaphor and simile and all those kinds of things.
Well, it's interesting. This section, it had a reference to Zeno and sophistry as well.
Yeah.
Which, yeah, I don't take Kohler, certainly not, and I don't think Gass either really interested in those sophistry and what they do with that, which I thought was kind of interesting that was put in this section as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, anyway, I want to update my description of his academic career. So again, I think that explains a lot about his writing approach.
I agree with that. I think that I might be taking this in a different way than you were intending, Kaija, but with that statement, this section that we have, this last Philippic, has the part about the ants, the birthday party and the cake, the blood, about his mom and
Death of the
addiction.
parents, yeah.
Yeah, and then what's the fourth one? There's a fourth one, right? Yeah, Outcasts on the Mountains of the Heart, which is the repeat of the title of this section. And with the family ones in particular, you've got like this part to me, and this is what I was trying not to talk about too much last week when I came in late and had read too far and was off on the whole thing, but is like for Kohler's like childhood, as much as you take this all seriously and some of it like to be real, is pretty disturbing. I mean, really disturbing. And that the family impact on his life is very, very obvious and harsh. Like the fact that he like even as a fleeing to Germany. So the two things that come up in here specifically are one, his aunt is like a hoarder, who loses her job and has like millions of like notepads and pens and boxes that are empty, filled with other boxes, filled with wrapping paper, filled with new boxes. That is something that strikes very close to myself and my life with my parents, in particular, are hoarders of that nature too. So I get that, and that sort of like over the top accumulation of stuff for like reasons that are hard to articulate. And then the thing with like his birthday party, his personal experience with his birthday party not taking place, his mom not sending out the invitations or whatever, the cake that she makes, the whole thing being a total failure is like very personal and hurtful. And then you have like the scene that's recounted from the that we talked about earlier, where the his dad is dying. He calls the ambulance. They come and they like take out his mom because she's like wasted, drunk, and incapable. And he's like, "No, you've got the wrong person." And it all goes like chaotic and sideways when he's like, I forget if he names how old he is there, but it's like under, not really even like driving age. Like
Is
he's
it 15?
Thought it was
yeah, I was gonna say
15.
Yeah,
15 too.
15. Yeah.
So like right around that period, which is like really intense. And like all of those traumas of like the personal failure, the aunt's history of like how she's involved in their house and like the grandmother and hoarding, and then like the drunkenness and the having to take care of your parents at an age that's pretty, I mean, 15 is not old to be having to deal with like those things. For him then to be like, I want to go to Germany. I want to be a poet. I'm going to give up on poetry to become a historian. I'm going to go to Germany, get the fuck out of here, and like then become like kind of obsessed with this like things didn't happen. Like to have a childhood in which you have no friends and you don't have a birthday party and you're dealing with like your drunk mom and your dying dad is like enough to just be like shit did not my cards that were dealt were unfair.
Yeah.
And leads kind of into that greater uh party of disappointed people sort of scene. But I thought that like related to what you're saying, like the family does kind of grip you, and restrain you in certain ways because of like where you're born and what your setup was. And this part that we finally get to in the tunnel is like where you're seeing like that aspect of it, like pretty like straightforward in a way. This is a much more straightforward section to me than a lot of the rest of the book was.
Yeah, and I mean, I was interested in seeing where the section would end, and I think that's kind of maybe where I've been writing for the last 300 pages is where is this all headed? Where are we going to end? Is it, I jumping forward a bit, I thought that if the book had just ended with Martha coming in and dumping the dirt on his desk and going, clean it up, and that was it, I would have been also fine with that. That would have been, I mean, it would have been a little more slapstick than I think is needed for or meant for this book, but just that even that like the metaphor of a fist closing, like I guess you can think of it either as that, in my notes I say the suffocation of family and familial obligation and that constriction, but also the closing of a family fist kind of with the death of both of his parents or the death of his dad and his mom being committed. It's like five fingers down to nothing, right? You're just sort of you're left with a stump. And I thought it was really interesting also in this section. His aunt seems far more human than previously. I think previously she seemed very militant and kind of mean. And then this section, she just kind of seems like she's trying to, she's not helpful, but she is kind of trying to, be a neutral presence or maybe a bit of an absorptive presence, kind of like a sponge. So when the mom screws up, she's like, you can still, it's a cake. You can still eat it, or like, that's okay. Like, don't worry. So I do like the focus on metaphor. And I actually, if Gass's dissertation can be read, I would love to read that. I think metaphors are a close second to my love of puns, is my love of metaphors.
Which is the opposite for Gilbert Sorrentino is like anti-metaphor, which calling back to one of our earlier TMR seasons,
Yeah.
which is something that gets played with a lot in Mulligan Stew, is
Yeah.
the idea of like relying on metaphor for meaning and like how that like undercuts the writing and the ability to say things directly.
Hmm.
I found the the image of the going through the ants stuff very striking, especially when it happens in this book. A house stacked full of boxes, and you open them hoping to find something, and there's nothing. And you open another hoping to find something, and there's nothing. And then maybe by the seventh or eighth one, you find a tag, and you look at the tag, and it probably means something, but you don't know what it is. And I'm thinking about that with this unfolding story of memories and these little snippets. And ooh, what are we going to get from this? Probably nothing. Like, I'm collecting all of this, but what are you left with? And it's just like this museum of just empty boxes. And I don't know, like, I found that part and how it was described, and so like those details just spoke the infinite to me with this work. These hoarding nothing. You're hoarding nothing.
Yeah, yeah, you're hoarding it. That is, you're hoarding a whole lot of nothing. I think that again with the suffocation of nothing and the suffocation of knowing what your family is doing or going through. I think even with the narrator, with Kohler recounting his 15-year-old self too, where it's too adult, to Chad's point of it's so much for a 15-year-old to go through. And doesn't he say that, he kind of like sort of estimates when it's time to call the ambulance for his dad. And then one day he like bides his time, jerking it in his room, doing his stuff. And then one day he's like, it is today. Today's the time that everything sort of starts to fall apart. Um, and it keeps me coming back to this idea we keep talking about, which is how a person is the sum of their experiences, but what experiences in particular. I went from a place of thinking, like one of my notes says, can traumatic response come from non-traumatic experience, where like the mom's cake didn't work out? Like but that's also a small piece of a bigger issue of her alcoholism and the family being dysfunctional. And it's not, I don't know.
But
I
that
don't want to
cake's
say it.
another giant metaphor.
Cake's another giant
Like,
metaphor.
holy cow, that's
So
a cake.
sticky.
Sometimes a cake is a cake, but sometimes a cake isn't a cake. That was not a cake.
Well, your non-trauma trauma question or idea. There's also a sense in there though where Kohler is waiting for his dad just to go off because of just the disaster of the party, and he forgot to mail the invitations, and this cake is falling apart. And he doesn't really. I mean, he's obviously not happy, but he doesn't have like a volcanic eruption. But Kohler keeps kind of waiting for it, and that also is a kind of trauma. There's that question in psychological circles. The spouse who isn't physically abused but is believes they're constantly under the threat of abuse is not just as abusive as actual physical abuse. And so the fact that the father has got them conditioned to think that he's going to have this major eruption is a type of abuse and a type of trauma in itself.
Like
Yeah.
a internal panopticon situation, but emotional rather than watching. You're always aware that it's about to explode or could explode at any moment. Yeah.
Yeah. And the things that do go wrong, there's a line that recurs a few times in this section. Maybe it is like the motto for this section, which is, I learned not to think about it. Where as a kid he dissociates. And I think that also goes back to the writ large historical aspect of people just dissociating. You learn not to think about it. When it gets to be too much, you just check out.
I mentioned this a few weeks ago, but it comes to mind as you're saying that too, that again, this book seems to set forth one way of approaching it or talking about it is that in all these instances, it's taking Kohler as being kind of like a fascist, leaning, misogynistic, bigot, shitty person. And then like, where did that come from? Where is that coming from? What are the conditions that create this to be possible? And in this case, it goes back to like, is it the family? Is it these things that can help like build into that. And none of these are satisfying on some level. Like none of it excuses like who he is and who he's represented as. Even though like these garner the most sympathy. Like I feel like the most sympathetic parts of this book are here. Like I as a kid, I said this in text, but like I had a birthday party where no one came. It rained. Everything sucked. It was like so traumatic to me. But like that doesn't excuse me like hating a certain group of people later on.
Yeah.
That's just like me hating life, I guess. But that's kind of
Chad's
the point.
hated
Like,
children ever since. Never
yeah,
grew out of it.
children, fuck children's parties. I don't want any of that.
And
But
then he's
like,
transferred that hatred to dogs, so you see how this all works.
yeah, that's her. Yeah, and you mean me? I've transferred my hatred to dogs.
That's what I said. Yeah, Chad. Yeah.
Well, in psychological circles, the wild card factor is always genetic predisposition. So that's why, two people can have almost identical experiences, almost identical traumatic experiences, and one person is just basically damaged for life by it, and the other person's like doesn't seem to have any, immediate or long-term impact on them whatsoever, and there's just no way to obviously figure that out. At least not yet, maybe in the future. But yeah, so, one person who has, and I think Gass is maybe a good example of because I think a lot of these two sections are probably drawn from very legitimate autobiographical. I mean, his dad was, like a painfully arthritic and bigoted, and his mom was an alcoholic. Gases, he's talked about on a lot of occasions. So I think a lot of this is probably almost biography or memoir more than fiction. But yet he became this successful, college professor and world acclaimed writer, and had, family and kids and all cats and all that stuff. And, other people will be completely, destroyed by it and become criminals and become whatever. So yeah, it's hard to know how someone is going to respond to a given situation.
It's in one of the Joy Williams piece that's in the Tunnel at 25 that I was looking at today, has a point that reminds me of a little bit, where I think it was her, because that one's set up where it's like two people asking each other questions or he's playing, and I don't remember who was the question asker for this, but was that basically like that the book, and if you look at the Into the Tunnel interview, interview with Gass in here, he's like, this isn't a political book per se. This isn't about the current politics. This is not to be read necessarily as a reflection of that. He's like, I didn't even really like do any research into World War II. This isn't like the point of it. And in one of them, either Joy Williams or the person who wrote it with her, I'm forgetting, says something effective like, all this stuff was like, this book comes out in the Clinton era, and, there's a little bit, you're aware that there's something under the surface that's going wrong. But it wasn't until Trump runs that all of a sudden all these people kind of pop out. And it's like all that stuff was just latently there. And sort of like a trauma impact or any of the psychological things we're talking about, like where those things happen, they can just have those latent effects. It can be years and years and years before it shows up. You may not even notice it. And then once the conditions are ripe, boom, there you are. There you now have like the pain or the hatred. And it's interesting in the book itself, but it's also interesting to think about this in terms of the statement of not reading it in relation to politics, because I don't know that's possible right now. I think that at a point in time that was where you could just be like, divorce it. But right now it's really hard not to like read into a current moment with this, which is like shifts is to me interesting in terms of like how a book shifts over time, and the way that you can receive it and the way that it can be talked about and reborn and get new life into it. This book in a way should have new life now because it is more political than it was back then, even if like nothing structurally has changed with it, and the issues are still the same issues that they always were. Once things are opened up, people are going to be a little fascist, and once they have the chance, they do it.
Yeah. So, sometimes you all talk about the audiobook. I'm curious, did you get like the liner notes with the audio?
Yeah.
Because, Gass has something in those liner notes. It's kind of a novelist faux pas to explain your work, but the liner notes and the audiobook, he pretty much explains what's going on in the book. And these are the 12 themes I was working with, and blah, 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 blah. And one almost gets the impression that, the book came out in 95 and yeah, it won some awards, but by and large, people just didn't get it, And in the interviews, Gass talks about, mostly people just shrugged and just ignored it, And so I almost feel like, after a few years, he felt like, you know what, I need to tell these SOBs what this book is about because nobody's getting it. People have stopped reading it. It's on the verge of going out of print all the time. So here it is, everybody. And so he does a really good. In fact, I keep a copy of the liner notes in my copy of the tunnel because it's so helpful to look at. Okay, this is, and the other thing I know you guys have been a little bit focused on was trying to figure out, why does this section have 3 subsections and why does this have 4 and my sense is he wanted 12 sections overall. He talks about how he wanted to structure it like a 12 tonal musical, whatever structure. And so I think his goal was to have 12 sections. And so in order to achieve that, he had 3 here, 4 there. And some of them have more than 4. The one I was on last time, just 1. Right. So I don't know that there's any use or merit in trying to decode why this section has 3 and that has 4 and this has 2, blah, blah, blah. I think the overall thing, I think he had those 12 themes that he was trying to hit. And sometimes he needed 3 sections to hit all of them. Sometimes he needed 4. Sometimes he could do it in 1. So that's my sense of his MO here, that he wanted that golden number of 12, and whatever he had to do to get there, that's what he was going to do.
That makes sense. That totally makes sense. I do think that there's something there's an internal logic with each section that kind of comes into being, though, where you start seeing it from the different angles, like from 3 different ways or from 4 or from 1, depending on that setup of it. That makes sense. And as we read it, I felt more comfortable with that. Even which section was it that begins with, it was the Susu one, which is somewhat in some ways one of the more challenging sections for me, but opens with the very dense part. And even reading that, I was like, I know, because I've read enough of this to know that that's not going to be how this is throughout it. There's going to be a shift, and there's going to be a shift that illuminates some aspect of this very dense, slow going part. And that's when it switches to the story about learning how to drive. And I think that there's something about his way of doing that you learn as you go, the way that a great book teaches you how to read it or teaches you how to reread it, I suppose. There is something that even if it doesn't have to fit these kind of number schemes, you start to know, to feel where the shifts are, and it makes it easier to approach. Because I think the liner notes are interesting, because that was in there when we were doing that. That was part of one of the projects I worked on, and marketing those and helping put that whole thing together. And it is, looking back on it, at the time it just felt like a natural extension. It's only 10 years after the book comes out, less than 10 years after the book comes out. That's not that long, right? In terms of time that's passed for the critics to have spoken, for things to have happened, for it to come. But you're right that it felt like a book that was already one of those books that people back in the day spent a lot of time reading, but that today people aren't spending as much time getting into. But it really wasn't that old. And I was reading, I think it is on the Tunnel at 25 too, the Stephen Kellman reference that when when he was writing that, there's only, what was it, 41 citations of this book in the wherever that is, and then most of them come from this End of the Tunnel book that he did in 1998. And I was like, holy shit, that doesn't track for me. In my world, this has been written about and discussed and studied and gotten into and unpacked in a way that is feverish and dedicated. But from what you're saying too, looking back on it in the liner notes, I think you're right. He's giving hey, if this book is going to last in that sense, if it's going to hit that Ulysses level where people are trying to find these references, trying to find new things with it, they need something. And if it was the 12 Philippic guideline to it, maybe that's enough to get the ball rolling again. But I never really thought of it that way, because in my mind it was in a totally different world. If the piece from Stephen Kellman said there's 5,000 references, 4,000 of them after the year 2010, be sure, that totally makes sense too. But it's not. It's the opposite. And you've mentioned this too, Ted, of there's not that many people reading it. And I don't know, I always assume people have read everything and that I'm the only one that hasn't spent enough time or doesn't have enough knowledge or whatever. But you're right. It what he wrote was very helpful. And it is one of these books that it could easily get lost in terms of time.
Well, I know we keep comparing it to Joyce, and I think rightly so. And Joyce was very similar. I mean, he kept, seeding the clouds with, trying to get people to explain what he was doing, both in Ulysses, but definitely when he was doing Finnegan's Wake, he was, making sure people knew, and he was giving people the, like with Ulysses, the symbols and what they represented and what his motif was for, because he was afraid people weren't getting it. And they didn't understand what a genius he was because they weren't understanding it. So he was going to have to help them along, So I think Gass was doing a bit of that, trying to help people. And I've also been thinking, listening to you all talk about this, that there would have to be a Joycean-like industry in order to unpack even just this book, let alone Gass's whole oeuvre or whatever. Because as you were talking, if you guys have been talking about, I haven't been rereading it all the way. I've just been rereading the sections that I was going to come on and help talk about. And, I think you guys know the book better than I do at this point, because it's been so long since I read through it, but it's just so dense. There's just so much stuff going on. And I think, even with like big books like Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake too, to a point, there is a sort of overarching narrative structure that people can wrap their heads around. Oh, it's Bloom walking around Dublin, or there's the story of going on in Finnegan's Wake with the misconduct in the park and rumors, and then Anna Olivia has to write a letter to help her husband out, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's a story there, right? Yeah. But here it's like, what the hell is the story exactly? I mean, and I think, these two parts, as I was rereading them, last couple of days, especially today, I think the ant thing, I mean, that's a pretty solid standalone short story. I mean, a long one, but a short story. And the cake party thing, I mean, that's a pretty good standalone short story, but yet they're embedded in this overarching narrative that a lot of people are never going to get to those stories. But it does, I think, explain why so many parts of this book were published independently and won pushcart prizes and O. Henry's and Best American Short Stories, et cetera, because they are taken out of context. And I think that was part of the wonderment. And I know a lot of really good readers, academic scholars and so on, postmodern scholars, who are just really disappointed in the tunnel, and they would never go back and spend much time on it. And I think part of it is, there were like 25 years of foreplay, and you see all these individual parts, you think, oh my God, this is going to be a fantastic novel. And then it comes out and it's not what anyone was expecting. And so there was just this, kind of disappointment on the part of a lot of people that it wasn't better or different or something than what it is, but it's its own thing.
That's
Do you then think those people missed out, in a manner of speaking? I mean, we have the luxury of reading it as a whole.
Maybe, but I do think it requires such a time commitment that life is only so long. I mean, it took Gass 30 years to write it. I keep thinking about things that are worth writing about in the tunnel, but I keep saying, well, I'd have to write a book as big as the tunnel to begin to discuss just this one little aspect of it. I mean, it just kind of keeps folding out. I mean, apparently at one time, I do vaguely remember I was going to do something on the Windows references, and I started to make notes in the back of the book about all the Windows references, and I just gave up. I'm not going to be able to say anything remotely meaningful about this unless I write a whole freaking book about it, which I, do another doctoral dissertation on just the use of Windows in the tunnel or something. I wasn't going to commit to that. And so it's just hard. It's just so, I think, Brian, you were saying that as much as you love the sentences, oftentimes it's just each page is just a time consuming slog. I mean, I also got the impression, Brian, that it was your idea to do the tunnel for your podcast.
Unfortunately, it was. Yeah.
What's the backstory there? What was your?
The backstory was I just try to pick books that I want to read, but I haven't gotten around to do, and so this forces me to do it. So, if you want to pick this up for your own pleasure and curiosity, you're a weirdo, which I love. So no, I picked it because coming off the back of Pynchon and Vineland, I thought this would be a good work to check out, and I've always wanted to read it and hadn't got around to doing it yet. So it was for my own pleasure, basically, and it's apparently a sick pleasure, like when I made us read Kathy Acker. So
Well, it's a big commitment. I mean,
yeah.
obviously time wise and everything else. So
Yeah, absolutely.
This other weird thing I was doing, I thought it relates really well to this work. I kind of want to pose this question to you. I was reading Hamlet again, and I was reading Harold Bloom's books on Hamlet because I want to sound smart at cocktail parties. And so I was watching this interview with Harold Bloom and Charlie Rose, and like Charlie Rose looks like a creep in it, and Harold Bloom looks like he just fell off of a bike and like showed up at the at the interview, and they're having a talk, right? And I'll paraphrase it because he uses way too many words to say something that should be simple. But he talks about how reading can heal us, and the only way that happens, according to Bloom, is like if you're reading something deeply and it's of your own interests and it explores something profound that came before you. But it has to be you have to be solitary and read something like that, but it has to be a work that is permanent and deep and lasting and requires all of your faculties and attention. And I just thought, the tunnel.
yeah,
Like
there you go.
it is a monster. It's profound. If you want to get anything out of it, you better sit and pay attention because you can't have the TV on, do something with the kids, feed the dog, and take down a chapter of it. You'll get nothing from it.
Hmm. Hmm.
But for me, it's one of these books after having the sections of it and the end of it here. Like it really makes me like question myself. It makes me want to question my place in my community, with my past, with how do I deal with my own past? What kind of person do I want to be? Like wonderful, important, profound questions that you have to wrestle with if you're going to read this. Whether or not it's a lasting work, I can't. Obviously, none of us can. It should be. I think it will be. Just because there's so much paper to get through, it won't go away anytime soon. It'll sit on a shelf for.
Yeah. Well, I
But
mentioned that Unbound Editions
Yeah.
talked about doing an Unbound edition of the Tunnel. So I don't know if that's in the works or not. I want to believe that it is. I want to hope that it is.
I given the people in charge of actually publishing it now, I doubt that if it's in the works is going to get all fucked up. But that's for a different podcast. But one of the things that you're saying though, Brian, too, is like that learning from it. I feel like part of the end of this book addresses that in the sense of Kohler being like, well, what was this all for? I tried to dig this tunnel. I put all this dirt in here. She dumps the dirt. She finds it. I wrote all this. What am I going to do? I'm going to try not to be like this anymore, I guess. Like it has that sort of like not deflated, but there's that feeling of like, yeah, like I've unearthed all this trauma and hate and examination and looked at it and just a bunch of pages.
Yeah. In a world of Kohlers, be a Martha.
Well,
Just be a
you mentioned repression there a bit ago. I mean, we obviously symbolically kind of have that. I think he basically says that he's kind of run out of pages to put pages of his Guilt and Innocence book to put pages of this book into anyway. So he'd kind of reached the end of the line in that sense. And so it was apropos that Martha dumped all this dirt, kind of buried it again. So, in a sense, he was sort of psychologically unearthing all of this stuff, and now she has buried it again. And so one wonders, is that it? Is it just going to stay buried, under the piles of dirt that she's dumped on it? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly read that part as with no specific answer, but definitely a hint of potential relief in Kohler's voice at that point of like, I could just leave it, and that's what it could be, and just walk away. And I do want to say, I do also appreciate the opposite, the idea of like yeah, like in a world of Kohlers, be a Martha, where Martha basically comes in and is like, all of your dirt and your garbage, don't make it my problem.
Yeah.
Like, get rid of it, clean it. It has nothing to do with me. I need it done by yesterday.
Well,
And
she also
I
like,
kind of
oh,
appreciate that.
yeah, but like, I'm trying to remember her. She works at a museum, right?
Did she talk about having a store before this?
I think there were parts in the last two sections where it made allusions to that, where she's like bringing stuff to and from the store, and I
Okay.
guess now we know that it's her store. I don't know, Ted, do you have any?
Well, like I said, you guys have probably read this more recently than I have, those sections. But my recollection is that her family owned a store, right? Like the
Right. Right.
Feeney's or something
Beanies.
like that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so all these antiques have something to do with her Now, whether she inherited it or these are just the refuse when it was, went were put up for sale or something. I don't remember the specifics there, but there is this, yeah, some kind of family history of store ownership, furniture store ownership.
Yeah. I remember that part, but then I was like, it seemed disconnected, from the current moment. But
In
there's
the liner notes, it says that there's Martha, the narrator's wife, who is now a curator for a small town historical museum, and along with Kohler, they're goring fat, is the descriptor he used.
Yes.
It's funny, but there is too like the question of this book, like what is it all for? In some sense, like we've gone through all of this. There's all these like interesting ideas, this beautiful writing, these beautiful sections, very disturbing sections, all this, and like what is it for in the end? And there's one going off of like the psychological side of things and like the therapist nature of it is that by unearthing trauma, you can resolve that trauma. You can address that trauma, right? Like this is a very basic, like kind of overly simplistic way of talking about like therapy. Like you bring things to the light, you address them, and then you move on. And in this case, like this book is sort of a testament to doing that, bringing up all of the traumas, all of the badness, and then by writing it, by saying it, does that absolve you? Does that then free you and give you like liberate you from the past, from your own trappings, from your own things? And I feel like the last page is basically him being like, nah, not really. He's just like even like the part that's like the most positive where he's like, write no more propaganda for the PDP, achieve dignity. It also feels like it's kind of like, yep, that's what I'm going to do now. I'm done with this. I'll just like stop it and, be good. It just doesn't feel legitimate or like that. It doesn't feel or like real in a sense. Like, I don't know that like even reading this book and addressing like, oh, I see where these impulses exist within myself and how they could metastasize into something that's really awful. And I would like to cut that off. But did I like related to what you're saying, Brian? Did I learn that? Did this have that impact? Or is it just like this is occupying my mind and entertaining and wildly funny and very complicated? And I'm very engaged with it on these ways. But has it changed who I am at all? Has it undone something or has it like not? And not just for me as a reader, but then Kohler as a person or as a character.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that makes me question, like you said, is that something that becomes learned or realized? Like would Kohler have gotten there, or would he have said those things without Martha dumping the dirt? If she had never entered the room at that point, would he have come to those same statements? Or
I love the image. It's heartbreaking, obviously, but just before that section, his last moments with his mom, she's playing solitaire, but she's cheating.
Yeah. And the crossword cheating.
And these things you're supposed to do with yourself, why would you cheat at them?
Yep.
And now we have Kohler just sitting in a chair, solitary, like by himself, alone. It's like the way those are next to each other. I found very, very striking and very telling.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one of my interests when I got into all this was chaos theory, and I mean that was obviously very, important to a lot of the postmodernists. Pynchon got into chaos theory and entropy and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I know in my first visit with you all, I talked about how the beginning of the story is kind of like this whirlwind, this chaotic whirlwind, and then from that we get all these different pieces. Well, I think it kind of ends there too. I think by the end the whirlwind has returned, and it's a very chaotic sort of ending in terms of language, and we got the poems, and eventually the poem that kind of zigzags all over the page, and so I think we kind of end where the book begins, which might be some suggestion that no, it's just a continuous loop, and we haven't come out of it. We haven't come out of the tunnel in spite of the, the tunnel like anus at the very end of the book or whatever. So I don't know. I mean, I want to always be an optimistic person, so I'd like to think, Kohler is somehow going to be better for all this, for having vented all this, but I can't point to any evidence of that per se.
There is still the question, did Kohler ever do anything wrong aside from think these things and write these things? Like he's mean-spirited, but we're seeing it through his lens that he's admitting to himself in this situation. Is it possible that, like, honestly, and he references, like, during the Crystal Knock section, he never really does shit. Like, he'd like to think that he would be maybe part of something possibly or not, but he doesn't really do things. Which is interesting in terms of, like, yeah, you just write and release. But, like, does it matter? One thing I wanted to ask you, Ted, before I forget, though, that's like off topic of this, is one of the other things through this section that sort of reframed the book is I feel like a lot of this is about addiction too. Like there's a lot of addiction throughout this book. And I know you wrote about that related to the Peterson kid. And I was curious if you had thoughts about that in relation to the tunnel as a whole and just the role. I know we've talked about his Gass's personal life and his personal biography and the relationship to an alcoholic mother. So alcoholism is in here. But I feel like there's addiction written more in that kind of Burroughs naked lunch addiction to things idea in here, and that it comes through in various ways throughout. And I was curious if you had thought about that, written about that, or contemplated it.
Well, I don't think I've really written about it per se, but I certainly have thought about it. And actually, I've been thinking about it because, you've broached this. I think the last episode in particular, you talked about that because you had read ahead accidentally, et cetera. Yeah, Gass talks about, having like word drunk narrators, like even going back to like Omensetter's Lock and the Ferber section where it's just this mass monologue, of Ferber's or whatever. And so I think that there is a sense of that Kohler is just as addicted as his mother was, but his addiction is words, and language and that kind of thing, and then he surreptitiously hides the pages within the other book and the dirt within the furniture, just like mom is surreptitiously hiding the gin around the house in different containers. And it's obvious that's not
her medicine.
Yeah, and so I do think there's some acknowledgement that maybe we all have a kind of addiction, and for Kohler and for Gass, perhaps, that addiction was a language that,
I was thinking he's also addicted to feeling put out, to feeling shitty. Like there's a level to which, like, the MAGA crowd likes to feel like they've been, like, put upon, like, and they're addicted to that sense of it. But, like, all the addictive things that go along with that, like you're saying, you hide shit, you lie, like you keep doing the thing that you want to stop doing, like you keep, like, all that's in this book and through Kohler and through other parts, not just with like drugs or alcohol or that version, but like the behaviors are similar. Like never tell the truth, always like keep it all secret, keep going back to that same well, expecting a different result, expecting to like find the, like, release of, like, get yours finally. Like it's all kind of there as like and I have had the thought before that we're all just kind of addicts. It's just like depends on what you get addicted to that will sort of shape where you go. Like people are addicted to religion and God and evangelicals. Like that's a different form of this. But like I don't know. It was striking me more and more after reading your piece way back at the beginning of this, and then getting this end where it started like hitting the sweets, the hoarding, the alcohol, the like writing, all of it like feels like that same coming from a similar source of like, being hooked.
Well, and maybe as we talk about it here, maybe it also is connected somehow or another to the metaphor of the tunnel and the metaphor of the empty boxes. the metaphor of empty everything, that addiction is all in the service of trying to fill some void.
Yep.
But one would suggest one reading of this book is that those voids are unfillable. No matter how much you drink, no matter how many words you write, no matter how much stuff you hoard or whatever, that emptiness is still going to be with you, inside of you. Yeah.
That's maybe where like my obsession with the threes and fours comes from too. Is like one was when you were talking about the windows, I kept thinking of the four parts as being four sides of a window, but also there's like the typical three of like the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and it sort of evades that, but that it does leave like an emptiness in the middle of it. Like it describes the surroundings, but doesn't give you that main point to it at times. But yeah, I mean, the emptiness that drives addiction is really, that's real. And that's like a thing. And I can see that being part of this, like you say, with the tunnel, with the empty boxes, with all of that. It's really, the book is just everything. Like there's so many ways to pick this apart and to look at it and to discuss it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Brian, you're usually interested in like if it earned its ending. Did this book earn its ending?
I think like Kaija was saying, like I have no idea how this thing was going to land, and anything he chooses at this point would be fine because I feel like it could go on forever, or it could stop whenever, and it would be fine. I heard this joke that they were trying to figure out for Saturday Night Live. It was in the 90s with Chris Farley was going through a drive-through. And Chris Farley, in case you live under a rock, he was very large, high energy, did lots of drugs. But he always had this like frenetic energy. And he's in the drive-through and he's ordering, I want 16 cheeseburgers. Let me get 16 fries. I'll get a Diet Coke. Can I get 16 apple pies? Like, and they're in the writer's room and they're trying to write this joke and they're all sitting around working on this sketch. And then it says, the person in the booth says, will that be all? And then it just says TBD ... They're trying to figure out, how do we end this thing? And Norm Macdonald is in the corner of the writer's room and he goes, hey, I got an ending for your sketch there. He says, yes. And I feel like this just had an ending that was just like, all right, what's next? Yes.
Yep.
Like for me, that like it, I think he nailed it.
Well, your yes obviously mirrors the end of Ulysses.
That's what I was thinking too.
And I think that we get both Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake in the end of this pretty deliberately. Mm-hmm. We've got this sense of lying down, as Bloom does at the end of Ulysses, and then the I like the river. Shall I like the rivers rise? So I think Gass is deliberately trying to do that, and of course we know Ulysses ends with that oversized dot or period or whatever it is, and this ends with the anus symbol or whatever. So I think Gass, he had to be looking for some way to end this book too, and so maybe he was drawing on some of his idols and some of the books that he loved too, and drawing on Joyce particularly for his ending there. Who knows?
That makes a lot of sense, and that I forgot about the dot part of it, but that totally tracks for me. And it's hard. Endings are hard because there's different criteria for them. Like you want in most like more commercial fiction, you'd want there to be something that, in like a Greek like analysis of plays in the whole catharsis way of like having that resolution so that you as the audience member have found closure, right? And like that's always artificial, or that's so frequently artificial, especially in the hands of like most like I was going to say hack contemporary writers, but hack contemporary writers, like the MFA sort of school of like get to that part where you have the the revelation and there's the end and everyone can like feel good about it, and that doesn't feel earned. And then like, but most of them, if this book is part of what Kohler says early on, that a book is like a storage container for consciousness or something like that, that it is that the ending would be having completed and created a whole consciousness. And maybe at the ending point of this, it's like this is the end where like he's been caught. He's been filling shit with dirt. He's been trying to fill up those empty boxes. They're being now emptied upon him. It's all done. He's like, the last thing he can say is like, "Nah, I'm just not going to do this anymore." And that's like still his whole consciousness. And it just needs to like, he needs to have the anus, the end of the end of the hole, the end of the
I
tunnel.
thought it was the cross section of a walnut.
I do
You
not
guys are all
think so.
seeing butts.
But then the
Well,
consciousness goes beyond those pages and beyond in some ways, but it exists there, and it has reached the point where it can be shit out into the world essentially. And here's the book: the consciousness has been shit out into the world.
Mhm.
yeah. Well, and I had said one of my favorite lines in that first section that I talked to you all about was the bit about entering the birth canal, basically. And so, in essence, he has sort of come out of the birth canal, except he's replaced the birth canal with the the rectum or whatever. But yeah, I don't know. Gas he didn't want people to look for meaning in his text per se. I mean, I think he felt like that was sort of a fool's errand to take a really complex book and try to boil it down to a theme, like a theme, a meaning. I think he was about a multiplicity of meanings.
Hmm.
And he always talked about how he wanted his books to be, his goal was to create a thing of beauty and just give it to the world.
Yeah.
And that's, of course, kind of the basis of his disagreement with John Gardner. Gardner felt like all fiction should have a moral component and that you should learn something from a text. And Gass, argued that, no, a book should just be, and it should be a thing of beauty and it just like a piece of artwork or whatever. Now that said, I think readers, human beings are meaning-making creatures, and so we're always trying to attach meaning to text. And I think that's what we're doing. We see meanings now, as you say, that weren't readily available or obvious in 1995 or whatever. But that, and if this book is read 100 years from now, presumably those readers are going to find other things to focus on. And I had a particular agenda the first time I read it for my thesis. I was looking for certain kinds of elements, and so I found them, but then as I read it again and again, then I see all kinds of other things going on in the text too. So it's just so multi-layered. It's like a Rorschach test or whatever. The reader sees in it whatever they're looking for. And Finnegan's Wake is that way too, right? I mean, everyone who reads
100%.
Finnegan's Wake, they all have it's metaphysics, it's the internet, Joyce anticipated, social media back in the 1920s or whatever, and you can just apply all kinds of things, but it's because you're bringing a particular paradigm to it, and it's so complex, you can find ways that it represents that.
Yep, absolutely. Brian, I found a quote that I wanted to read for you too from this Into the Tunnel interview with between Heidi Ziegler and Gass, where they say, if your novel is not, as one reviewer stated, modernism's last gap, is it postmodern? And Gass says, I don't think so. But then I've never been clear about the nature of postmodernism in literature. I think a lot of people would call the book postmodern because of the use of visuals, the presence of certain kinds of epistemological difficulties, and my extensive use of quotation. But all those things have been done before. I think of my work as late or decayed modern. Yes, last gasp will do. But it may be that if postmodernism is simply a foregrounding of techniques and approaches that were found more in the background in the past, then certainly it is postmodern. It just depends on what you mean by the slippery term, which makes sense to me only in an architectural context. And there signifies a rather shallow historical eclecticism. I can say that in this novel, qualities which were once marginal for fiction are made central, and things that were formerly central are thrust towards the edge, which I think is interesting, related to like our conversations about the use of the word postmodern, but also like as a look at the kind of architecture and structure of the book of like moving things, from the margins in and out. That is kind of like sort of engine for a lot of ways that this is put together.
Sure. Well, do you have a question?
Nope. I just wanted to read it for you because I know because usually bring up the question of like or the comments on like the term postmodern. And then since he reflected directly on it, I
No,
thought
yeah,
you'd find it interesting.
yeah. No, I always struggle with postmodernism. It's what everybody's all ooh like. When I was in school, it was always postmodernism and meta. Things being meta, and it's like whatever, okay, like
Well, in my dissertation, as I mentioned earlier, I was looking at that. Well, what's the origin of what we call the postmodern voice in the 20th century and so on? And one of the things I argued was that it's not unique to the 20th century. And one of the texts I used to try to illustrate that is Beowulf, the Old English poem Beowulf. And there's all kinds of things going on there that one certainly would identify as postmodern. But I think you can go back to Homer, and find things. So my thesis was that any sort of trauma, either individual or cultural, can produce texts which have elements which we now identify as postmodern or whatever. Even that meta text. I don't know if you probably haven't read Beowulf since freshman year English, class or whatever. But the Beowulf poet, several times in that poem stops and gives a little lesson on storytelling to the audience. And so comes completely out of the poem and says, hey, I'm doing this way because of this reason. And so, I think we can find all kinds of examples throughout history and in other cultures too of literature that definitely has, Tristram Shandy is another one that people want to point to as a postmodern text, way out of time or whatever. So yeah, I think Gass is warranted in saying, well, I don't know if this is postmodern. It's just kind of what I'm doing. Yeah, I found myself this time. Of course, I was reading quickly, and so any kind of optical disturbance was annoying to me. but the overlay of the crossword puzzle on a couple of pages when he was talking about the crossword puzzle, and Gass said that much of what he did in Willie Masters really didn't work. It was just kind of a gimmick. And I was thinking he's still doing it, man. I don't know what that's adding to the text here exactly. This weird crossword puzzle thing. I mean, I know he wanted in a perfect world that when the reader got to those pages, they would open up, oh, son of a gun, here's a crossword puzzle actually in the book,
Right.
and so that's what that's supposed to represent. But in this particular format, I don't really know quite what it's accomplishing.
It made it hard to read. For me, because like this is some of these words are obscured behind this like black like box in there. And then I also had the thought of like when he references in that section like, oh, 11 down is like a name for whatever. It's like Billy Kohler. And I was like, does that actually map onto the crossword that's on this page? And then I just didn't bother to look because I too was like, fine, I get it, whatever.
I don't think so, but I have never tried. I've had those thoughts too. Maybe if I really put my mind to it, I could make better sense of this and feel better about it. But like I said, today I was trying to read really fast to get it all done. And it's like, man, this is really annoying. I wish these crossword puzzle, squares weren't on this text, whatever. But again, and it's funny. It's talking about mapping or putting meaning on things. In the Peterson Kid, if you notice that in the text, there's really big gaps. Like there'll be like a period to end a sentence, and then there'll be like an extra long white space before you get to the start of the next sentence. I taught that story several times over the years. And, I'd always have my students think about it, and I would, pontificate. I think what's going on here is Gass is, making us really slow down and wants us to really consider what this image is about and so forth. And then sometime later, I don't know, I heard an interview with Gass, and he said, well, what I was trying to do was it takes place during a snowstorm, so I wanted as much white on the page as possible.
That's what I thought. I'm so glad that you said that.
All these years of me giving it this elevated meaning, it's like, nah, he was just going for the visual of a bunch of white on the page.
I associated that with snow or that his tab button was broke.
Well, I don't want to get too far into the minutia here, but there could probably be a movie made not about the tunnel, but about the finishing of writing the tunnel, because it was a Herculean event, because he finally almost age 70 goes to the Getty Center, and he spends almost a year there writing basically the last half of the tunnel. So it was his manuscript was about 600 pages when he went there, and 1,200 pages by the time he left. But he also one of the problems he had, and a potential publisher was going to have, was the first 20 some years of it he wrote on typewriter, so it wasn't like word processed. And now word processing had come along, so he had like this staff there at the Getty Center who were turning the first 600 pages into type, on a word processor. Meanwhile, he was writing new stuff, but then he would also go back and edit that stuff. So there was all this stuff happening. And then my understanding is, after he got the final proofs from Knopf, I don't know how many hours or days or weeks he spent going through, just item by item, correcting them, et cetera, et cetera. Somehow or another, when he sent them back to Knopf, they got lost for a time. So he had spent all these, hours, proofreading, and they were found eventually. But there was some, I don't know how much time elapsed where he thought that was all for naught. So it was almost a miracle that this book came out at all, when it came out in 1995. So
very true. Very true. There was one last thing I wanted to bring up before we wrap up, is that I thought that Ted and Brian specifically, you guys would gravitate towards page 640, which has a whole thing about craft at the bottom, which I thought was really interesting. I don't know if there's anything really to say about it, but for anyone who's listening who is curious about this, I thought this part was really spectacular, where the sentence is very long, but here, just starting kind of in the middle after a semicolon. Though there never was a person, whether called a poet, who could place syllables like silverware at will around a table, place platters like glistening ovals of shining celebration. No, these plates aren't wet. Lay platters like gleaming ovals of celebration. No, that's overripe. Lay platters like ovals of celebration. No, these plates aren't platters. Lay platters like circles of celebration. No, you may lay a platter, but you don't lay a plate. Put out plates like glistening circles of celebration. No, thought I'd got rid of glistening. Put down plates like shining circles of celebration. No, we don't put tables, we set them. Set plates like shining circles of celebration and have those sounds draw the guests meant to make their music, you mean. And I thought that was really interesting to see the kind of working through of like, here's a statement. And then like, no, that's not quite right. You got to turn it like this. No, that's still like emphasizing the wrong part. No, 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 no. To all the ways that you can like write one thing and get stuck on like, that's not exact. That's not exact. That's not what I'm saying. And then finally get there at the very end. But I thought that was really cool for like a craft perspective of stuff.
Well, and that's very much what he gets into in greater detail in his doctoral dissertation, looking at the individual words that make up metaphors and why they're metaphoric, and how this word has multiple meanings and how do we make use of those multiple meanings, and then giving examples from John Donne's sermons or from whatever, and so it's just. But one of the things I was going to say is Gass. And he even joked about this, that he really only had a kind of a handful of ideas, and he spent 60 years just writing about these same set of ideas. There was a celebration of Gass at like AWP 2009 or something, and he's always very self-deprecating. And after they 45 minutes of various people introducing him and how great he was, he starts off by saying, I'm just going to give you evidence that I really haven't evolved in the last 40 some years. And so he read like 3 different excerpts that all had to do with insects, starting with order of insects, and then a section on insects from Omensetter's Luck, and then after he did this book, Cartesian Sonata is very similar to this in many ways in terms of the issues he's dealing with. His last book, Eyes, again, he's getting into very similar kind of things. And I may have like the only copy of his very last book, Baroque Prose, where he actually goes back to the same writers and the same issues he was dealing with in 1948 on his dissertation, and continues that discussion and that so forth. And he apparently worked on this up to like 3 months before he died. It was his last book that he was working on. So it's really, I think for writers who are always trying to find a new idea to write about, Gass is a good example of, just keep working with the same ones, just keep making them maybe more interesting, more complex, whatever. But it is pretty fascinating that he has a pretty limited number of interests, and yet it created this entire huge canon of texts.
Yeah, a lot of words. What's happening with that book? Is anyone ever going to publish that? Is it just...
I don't know. One excerpt appeared in Lit Mag shortly before Gass died, and then a longer version of the same excerpt was published by Greg Gerke in his online journal, Socrates on the Beach.
Yeah.
But it's never it's never been. I don't know of anything that's in the works, to publish it. As a publisher, I would love to publish it, but I've kind of hinted at that. Mary doesn't seem very quick to take me up on it. Yeah, I don't know. It's a really fascinating book. But it's not done. I mean, it's only about 150 manuscript pages, and there are bracketed sections where Gass basically says if he had more time and energy, he'd rework this paragraph, but he doesn't. So he just kind of leaves it at that. So I don't know. Maybe the thought is it really isn't a final work, and so maybe it shouldn't be put out there in the world or whatever. Mary sent me the manuscript, attached it to an email, and I did a conference paper on it. But yeah, so as far as I know, I may be the only one who's ever really read it. But it's really fascinating.
That's really cool for someone.
Chad and Kaija quietly drooling on the inside of,
Seems like a good book for you to look at over there. But
yeah.
Well, if you ever need an editor for it,
we have each other's emails, Ted.
This is kind of a perfect place to leave this in suspense this whole season. Like, what's next?
What's next?
What could happen next? But I know we should wrap up. So next we're gonna be off for a few weeks. We'll announce the next schedule. The next book is gonna be Augusto Roa Bastos' I the Supreme. So from fascism to dictatorships in Latin America seems perfect. I don't know if this is topical, but there we are. But did you guys have favorite lines from this week?
Yes, I will go first just so I can not excuse myself, but just get myself out of the way. I do want to ask also really quickly, because we didn't really ask, I suppose, but did you all end up liking the book? Would you recommend it to a friend or family member? Maybe not family. Would you recommend it to a friend? That's a big no for family for me, but
I love the book. I have nobody I could recommend it to.
That's interesting way to put it. Yeah.
Except, well, I mean, I guess I'm looking at the people I would recommend.
Sure.
So,
I know. That's the problem with this podcast. It's like, oh yeah, I wish you guys would read this book with me. Oh wait, that's exactly what we just did.
Yeah, I'm exhausted.
Well, and my wife, I think, is an earshot around here somewhere, but she's a great reader. I mean, she reads she reads way more books than I do, and really good stuff too. And I've tried to get her to be on board the Gass train, and she cannot do it. She cannot get through a Gass book, and I've given her, more manageable ones, and he's very difficult because we're so conditioned to look for plot and character development. And he just refuses to give us that in all of his works of fiction, really. And so it's just, people go in with certain expectations and they're pretty quickly not met. And so, it's a hard slog then, especially a book like this. I wish it were, I think it would require a sort of, Finnegan's Wake-like reading group to really, you guys have done a Spartan job getting at so many important things in this book, but I'm sure you feel like you're just barely scratching the surface. There's just so much more that could be dealt with here.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, I will, my favorite line for this last week of the tunnel is on page 605. And it is, "What the hell? There's no point in having a history if this is what it's going to be used for. Almanackery."
I love that line, and mine ties into that. Is from 641. Writing is hiding from history.
Nice.
Just a clip. Brian, you got one?
I really, really, really like this cake. Mom making a cake. I just thought it was just.
It's perfect for your new novel.
It's some of the highest level. I loved it. And so I have two lines from it on the same paragraph on page. What page is this? 612. One is, "Boy, we almost had a good time." There's something just absolutely lovely, and but I'm looking at my chocolate cake. and then to what a lovely entry for that paragraph, and then it ends with this line: caring makes you miserable. Right? That to start there and by the end of it get you, oh, good Lord. Brilliant. Brilliant writing.
Yeah.
Feel it. Ted,
Shall
what
I
do you
offer
got?
one?
Yeah.
Please.
So I to 642, and it's the next to last paragraph on that page. It begins with, "I didn't understand then," but I'll just skip down a little bit. He said, if the poet wonders where yesterday's snows have gone, he is really mourning the melting of the drift he's standing in, feeling the cold claim his soggy shoes. The dust that closed Helen's eye is irritating his lids, dimming the view of all he loves. And this is the part I really like. And the Byzantium he believes in, so far away in past time's legendary space, is being built in his head by his own scribbling hands for all who read him to hold in theirs. And there's a couple of things I really love about that. It clearly is a hearkening back to In the Heart of the Country. And that's the book that was the book the story rather than Novella's story, whatever it is, that he used as a structural model for the tunnel. So he kind of does a callback there. But also, what he hoped to have happen with all of his books is that somehow the book would go, like the manuscript, let's say, would go from his hands and sort of materialized into the hands of the reader. And so there's like this communion that happens between his brain and the brain of the reader or whatever. And that's, of course, why he wanted this book to literally be the sort of thing that Kohler was producing, the sheaf of manuscripts to hand. And so here is this idea of the transfer of the book from one head to another, and then that materializes in the book that you're holding. I don't know. To me, that's just a wonderful image for writing and reading, and that connection between writer and reader.
I love that. This was the last comment I'm going to make is that there's a whole few paragraphs on 626 or 625, 626 that have like really great plays with like the words and the sounds of it. You've got like scummy next to buggy, and then like great line, cold cocked by the Scotch. I just think is a great sounding line. Good way to maybe wrap this up. So, anyways, thank you, Todd. Everyone, check out The Tunnel at 25. Check out A Lesson Before Writing. Stay tuned on the Substack for the next season for Eye of the Supreme. Rate us, review us wherever you get your podcasts. I guess buy The Tunnel, read The Tunnel. Tell your friends to read The Tunnel, I suppose. I guess. I don't know.
Not your family.
Not your family. Your family is going to think you're very weird if you do that. probably have
as if they don't already.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder if my parents have ever read a book that I've read. It's quite possible that we have zero overlap between our reading histories, which is a strange thing to say, but quite possible. So anyways, till soon, we'll be back. Thank you, everyone, for doing this, and thanks for listening along.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ted. Bye, everyone.
Make a Jack Reacher book club.
There we go.